I want to talk about Tumblr because I know that you see Tumblr at the root of a huge amount of what ails us as a civilization. First of all, explain what Tumblr is for people who don't know or can't remember.
Tumblr was a microblogging site. So it wasn't like a live journal or a blogger where people were writing like 4,000 word tomes about their day. They were writing like, I mean, it still exists, but at its peak, it was like 3 or 4 sentences if you're writing something. It was very image heavy. It had sort of like a feed like you would have on Twitter, where everyone's posts you would see it in one, in one stream. And it was very big with fandom. So if you wrote fan fiction, if you role played, if you drew fan art, and if you're really into like a certain media property, you were probably on Tumblr. And it started in 2007, if I'm remembering correctly. It peaked 2011, 2012.
So is that slightly predating Twitter?
Yeah, I think Twitter was 2009. And Twitter didn't really get big until a little bit later. But Twitter had different audiences, right? In 2013, I think Tumblr was the #1 site for like the 13 to 18-year-old age bracket. So it was really for teenagers. 2014 things start to taper off, but then you have sort of a second wave of Tumblr popularity, 2014 to 2017. At some point, they banned porn. I think they banned porn. I think I lived in Boston when they banned porn, so it might have been 2015. And that's when the demographics started to change, and it got acquired, and the website started to change. And now it's sort of, there's ruins. People still use it, but it's not the popular place it was in the early 2010s.
And why do you think that Tumblr has such explanatory power in looking at the place the culture's in right now?
So a lot of what we would call like wokeness, right? It wasn't created on Tumblr, but it was sort of like germinated on Tumblr, was introduced to a lot of young people. So the working theory as like wokeness went more mainstream was like, we sent our kids to those colleges and they came back, with their brains fried. But I interviewed like hundreds of people, and for things like privilege or different terms around gender identity, they learned it from Tumblr. And I think that very online teenagers brought these ideas to their university classrooms, and between that and journalists scraping Tumblr for content, like BuzzFeed journalists, sort of like lower tier, back when freelance writers were trying to create clickbait, and it was like $50 a pop or whatever. That's sort of how we had this explosion of wokeness. That was the lab leak. Again, not that these teenagers invented it. I know a lot of these things come from academia, but they come from like grad school and sort of like the outer reaches of activism and things that your average they had stayed contained for as long as they stayed contained for a reason, right? But what popularized them and what catalyzed the spread was Tumblr, was the people on the fringes of academia or activism or leftism or whatever posting to Tumblr, and teenagers taking that and going wild. And the vehicle of transmission, like how these two groups met each other, I suspect was fandom. So Harry Potter, Supernatural, Doctor Who, those adult nerds love that stuff, but so do kids.
Do you think there's something about wokeness which is particularly appealing to that kind of Tumblr ecosystem? It encourages, I guess, quite a lot of classification. I dimly remember, I didn't really use Tumblr, although I'm roughly that age group, there being a lot of people kind of listing all their different privileges and oppressions and whatever, and they're kind of almost like a listicle per person, which maybe is quite well suited to the microblogging. Is there something else as well about wokeness, do you think, that flourishes in that environment?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a lot of people who feel, they feel invisible. This feels so cliche to say, but like they feel invisible in their day-to-day lives. I mean, it's the same reason why like a 14-year-old would be a mall goth or would affect an eating disorder, or maybe even like self-harm. And all of these things have gone through cycles of popularity. And sometimes, right, sometimes your 14-year-old really does have an eating disorder or really is self-harming. But a lot of the time, it's just a way to sort of express their angst and their feelings of not being seen, or like not having an explanation for like much more ordinary pain, right? Like somehow it gives them more purpose. The problem is when, I think this is time immemorial. That's just the age group. But the problem is when you legitimize it too much, right? You don't want to silence these kids, but if you legitimize it too much, they never get to grow out of it. Eventually we all realize we're not the most special person in the world with the most special problems, and we mature. Tumblr sort of is like this, creates this feedback loop where you never break out of those chains.